Tennessee football just won the Super Bowl. That's what Spencer Rattler said after Saturday's game. Easy for him to say. He was sacked 6 times by the Tennessee Vols in an important victory at Neyland Stadium, a raucous Neyland Stadium. Adam Sparks was there. He joins us alongside John Adams, and I'm Blake Toppmeyer. Here we are on the Volunteer State. Guys, important result, as I said, for Tennessee. I don't know how good South Carolina is. In fact, I think they aren't very good. However, given what happened last year, I think this was an undeniable revenge game for Tennessee fans. Adam, I'm sure you sensed that in the stadium. But in terms of the on-field developments, some important happenings for Tennessee as well. Getting Cooper Mays back, getting the run game going. What was maybe your guys' most important takeaways from Saturday night, aside from just gaining some semblance of revenge for losing to South Carolina last year?
Yeah, well, first, let me just say the Super Bowl comment by Spencer Rattler, that was a funny way that came out in the press box after the game. The South Carolina media went down to, do that presser. The UT media went to the UT presser. And then none of the South Carolina media that I heard mentioned at all that comment. Sometimes maybe it doesn't hit in the same way if you're covering that team. And then one of the UT media relations staff said, "Hey, I think Spencer Rattler said this was the Super Bowl." And everybody was like, "What?" And then they suddenly started reviewing what the context was and all that sort of stuff. And it was funny because about a half an hour before that, so when the game ended, Tennessee's coaching staff left the coach's box, and at least one, maybe two, but at least one. And I don't know which coach this was. I have an idea, but I don't know which coach it was for sure. But one of the coaches was really celebrating, and you guys have been in press box where we hear this, right? The coaches run to the elevator to go down after a big win, and they're just yelling in celebration. And I sort of looked back, and all the media responded to it. Our eyes got big, and I said to a couple of guys beside me, I said, "Guys, it's just South Carolina." It was a really big weight off the shoulders. But it's you didn't beat Alabama, you didn't beat Georgia. It was just South Carolina. So then a little while after that, for then Spencer Rattler to then react in the same way that this was a huge game as a Super Bowl. It was funny, but it also, I think, pointed to the fact that this did mean a lot to Tennessee and a lot to Tennessee fans, maybe even more to fans, I think, than the team. It meant a lot, but then once you win the game, I think it's reasonable to look back and say, okay, it was still just South Carolina, and that's kind of where I'm at. It was a step in the right direction. The run game is good. The pass rush is good. The secondary can actually make plays, but all the positive things that you can pull out of this game, you still say, well, it's just South Carolina, and it's this year's South Carolina, a team that I think probably is going to be pretty close to the bottom of the East. They'll be better than Vanderbilt. Who else will they be better than in the East? I'm not real sure. And so positive for Tennessee, but there are tougher opponents coming forward. So I want to see going forward if Tennessee can do against better teams what it did in this one.
Spencer Rattler might be playing in a Super Bowl one day. He's a really talented quarterback. He won't be playing in a bowl game this year, though. South Carolina is horrible. One of the worst offensive lines we've seen, not just this year. Tennessee had a great pass rush. I thought that was significant. But a lot of teams will have a great pass rush against South Carolina. What stuck out to me was Cooper Mays coming back, and I thought the offensive line really gelled. When I see the difference he made, you move Ollie Lane over to guard, you strengthen yourself at 2 positions, and Tennessee ran the ball so effectively with 3 different running backs. That made a huge impression on me. South Carolina's defensive front is not as inept as its offensive line. It actually held Georgia down at times. Georgia only scored 24 on South Carolina, so I thought that was really significant. And I think it's going into a tougher part of the schedule. The health of Cooper Mays is crucial to this team. I mean, you could say it's crucial to everybody, but we saw the difference he could make, and the schedule would get tougher. Tennessee really needs Cooper Mays in there. I remember talking to Bill Martin in preseason, and he was talking to Tennessee's media relations director, and he was talking about the value of Cooper Mays. We just don't think about centers that much, even though they start everything on offense with a snap. But I just thought that was really interesting how much better it looked in the offensive line and running the ball.
And I think it's multifaceted with Cooper. I think people sometimes think of the leader of the offensive line, for whatever that means, and that he can make the line calls more efficiently because he's used to playing the position. But I think there's so much more to, like, when Cooper Mays comes to the sideline, him and Glenn Ellerby, the offensive line coach, I think have pretty in-depth conversations about what Cooper is seeing, what can work. You know, we tend to think about this sort of as the quarterback. Joey Halsley, the OC and quarterbacks coach, has talked the last few years about whoever his quarterback is. He wants to know what makes them comfortable. He wants to know what they're seeing as opposed to what's being seen from up above or from the sideline. And Tennessee, there's no way that they had that, at least not to the extent they needed, with Ollie Lane at center. He's used to playing guard. He's been a backup guard, serviceable backup guard through his career. Then he was suddenly starting at center, a position he's not super used to playing. And so he doesn't really have the vision to see what's going on in defense in little minute details that Cooper Mays does. And so I think it probably in some extent, I think it actually helps the play calling that Cooper Mays is out there. And you saw in that game where there were things that they had not done or not called on offense. And I think that's two parts. It's Cooper Mays being able to communicate things between drives, and that's also having confidence that they can pull things off that are a little more complex than they could with Ollie Lane or Dane Davis at center or anybody else besides Cooper Mays.
And Cooper Mays, as you guys have talked about, his return was so notable too. And Adam has written about this, I guess on the flip side, you know, so sort of the disappointing news from Saturday is the season-ending injury to Bru McCoy, kind of a really tough to watch ankle injury that's going to take one of Tennessee's best receivers out of the mix the rest of the way. So some good news on offense, Cooper Mays back. Some bad news as well with the Bru McCoy injury. And not just because of the injury situation, guys, but with that in mind, and then also, you guys kind of know the way Saturdays unfold. Like, the way you're feeling about a team at noon is not always the way you feel about a team come 10 o'clock in the evening. Like, a lot can change throughout the course of the day. So, you know, it's about noon or 12:30 on Saturday, and I am watching Kentucky just dismantle Florida. An embarrassing game for the Gators. You know, Florida looked every bit as bad as it did in that season opening loss to Utah. And I'm thinking, how in the world did Tennessee lose, not only lose, but lose decisively to this Florida team that looked like a joke in Lexington? And so at that point, middle of the day, it's kind of down on the Vols. And then by the end of the night, Bru McCoy injury was the downside, but overall an encouraging night for Tennessee. So given everything that happened Saturday, what we saw happen in Lexington combined with what we saw in Knoxville, are you feeling better, worse, or about the same about Tennessee as you did going into the day?
I feel about the same. Now, you know, I mean, a week ago on this pod, I said I thought they could go 3-1 in the next 4 SEC games. So they're now 1-0 in that stretch. I feel better that they could beat A&M now. I feel much better in that way because you saw the impact of the Neyland crowd. Now, this is going to be an afternoon game at Neyland, not a night game, but you saw the impact of that. If they're playing at home, they're going to be pretty tough to beat. If they're playing on the road and it's a loud road crowd, it's going to be pretty tough for them to win. And that's sort of where the line is right now. I think they're not good enough to overcome really difficult road environments That offense is not good enough to do it. Now with Cooper Mays in there, maybe that changes a little bit. But I think if you look at home games the rest of the way, you should pick the Vols. If you're looking at road games in tough environments against good teams, you should probably pick against the Vols. And I was looking at the numbers of, because we're thinking through Florida, and like you mentioned it, Kentucky steamrolled Florida. That was at the Swamp. And Tennessee obviously had one at the Swamp. One has not won at the Swamp in 20 years. Josh Heupel has you can see enough sampling now of his tenure to see kind of where the strengths and weaknesses are. In SEC games at home, Josh Heupel 7-2. SEC games on the road, he's 4-5. Now that makes some sense. He should be winning more at home than on the road. But who are the ones that he's beaten on the road? Who are the ones he's lost to? The losses, the SEC road losses under Heupel, the Swamp twice. And it's one of the loudest places in America. Just very difficult to win there. Alabama, really, really good team and a pretty loud environment. South Carolina, who has one of the more underrated atmospheres that you're going to face. Their crowd is usually better than their team. That was a difficult game to play out. And Georgia is the other one. At Georgia, that was the number one team in the country. Georgia is not necessarily known for having one of the loudest environments in the SEC, but I was at that game, and that was maybe the loudest college football game I've ever been at. So, again, good teams or tough environments or the combination of the both, they lose. They lost all 5 of those. Where have they won in the SEC on the road under Heupel? Missouri, Kentucky, Vandy, and then LSU. And the LSU game was a noon game. That was kind of a weird one, but Missouri, Kentucky, Vandy. If it's a tough road environment, it's a really good team, they're probably going to lose. And that's even when they've been at their best. If it's a home game, you're going into Neyland, you're going to get beat. And I think that's the way we should look at this. I think that's probably going to be the way it is the rest of the way. Now you get to the Georgia at Tennessee, that could be more of a coin flip depending on what Georgia's doing by then. But I feel better about what's coming up for Tennessee because I think the impact of that crowd is going to probably be worth 10 points the rest of this year.
I probably feel a little better about Tennessee, but I still have plenty of question marks. One of the things I've really noticed in covering Tennessee for so many years, going back to the 1998 national championship season, I remember those home games against Florida and Arkansas. When the game was on the line, it was a close game, could have gone either way, and the impact of the crowd in those games. Well, since Josh Heupel became the coach in this era, I think Neyland Stadium has the same kind of home field advantage that it had way back then. And I thought for many years it didn't. I didn't consider Tennessee to have as big a home field advantage as, say, LSU did or Florida did, certainly, or even Auburn or Alabama. But I feel like it has one of the best home field advantages now in college football. And I think that has a lot to do with how the fan base is excited about the program under Josh Heupel. However, I also think that in general, the SEC crowds seem to be louder. I noticed Missouri's crowd against Kansas State, and I'd never noticed Missouri's crowd before. I thought Kentucky's crowd was loud against Florida. I really noticed that, and that was an afternoon game. I think part of that has to do with fans not just being enthused about their program. I think they're really seeing that they can make a difference in a game. When you see those false starts happening, I mean, that really energizes a crowd. They feel like they're involved and they can impact the outcome. So I think that will continue to build in the second half of the season for Tennessee.
By the way, I think some of that is post-COVID. I really do. I think the fan bases in college football that were okay but not great, I think some after COVID, after games when you couldn't go to them, I think those programs, fans have faded away a little more. I think they've looked at it and said, I went without it for a season. It wasn't that bad. I think the fan bases that are the strongest, I think after COVID, you had more of a craving to go back, that you really missed it. And so I think that's why a lot of SEC crowds are as good as now as they ever were. What was, and maybe better.
Yeah, the fans at Vanderbilt never came back. They brought in a couple of cranes, but removed part of the stadium, which is fine because they didn't need all those seats anyway. So and they never came back. But all right, so we got Adam about the same, John a little better. Okay, well, that leaves room for me on the other side then, because I'm going with a little bit worse. And maybe it's partially what you guys are saying here, the home road split. As I watched Kentucky against Florida, and yeah, I acknowledgement of what Adam said. Florida hasn't lost to Tennessee at the Swamp since 2003. Maybe we were all naive thinking that Tennessee was ever going to win there. However, I did a piece before the season about the teams that enjoy the biggest home field advantage in the SEC. And the way I calculated it was the difference between their winning percentage on the road in conference games compared to their winning percentage at home in conference games. Now, one of the biggest differences in road home win percentage in the SEC in conference games, Kentucky. I know Tennessee hasn't lost to Kentucky much over the years, but when I watched that game on Saturday, I thought this Kentucky team looks like one of the best that Mark Stoops has had. And, I was sitting here a week ago, and I believe I said Tennessee would go 2-2 in this stretch of 4 games that started with South Carolina. I was counting Texas A&M and Alabama as losses. I was counting Kentucky as a win. And as good as it was for Tennessee to win by 3 scores, they got the run game going, Cooper Mays, the whole bit. I just came away from Saturday that impressed by Kentucky and the environment at Kroger Field. And talk about a Super Bowl. If Tennessee treated South Carolina like the Super Bowl, depending on where Kentucky's at record-wise in its season, when Tennessee comes to town at the end of October, Kentucky's got Georgia this week, probably lose that game. Then they get Missouri at home. What if they beat Missouri and they're 6-1 going into a Halloween weekend type of game against Tennessee at 6-1 in Lexington? Seems like that could be a night game. I don't know. That's where I come away feeling a little bit worse. It's not necessarily about Tennessee. It's about what I saw out of Kentucky. And that game to me is maybe more concerning than I would have thought in July or August.
I mean, it's all about right now in the SEC. There's so much parity, and I know you guys talk about this on the SEC pod. Is that it comes down to when teams are peaking. I think a month from now we're going to look at it, and whatever teams we thought were really good and hot this week, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Missouri, A&M. Some of those teams a month from now we're going to say, well, that's when they peaked that week, and it sort of fell apart after that. There's going to be 1 or 2 instances. It may be Tennessee. We may say, wow, they put up 40 on South Carolina, and then they faced tougher competition, and it just sort of crumbled. And so it's about when you peak. It's about how you deal with injuries. Tennessee did not really have a good replacement for Cooper Mays. That's a place they just couldn't afford to have an injury. They had one there. If he plays the Florida game, is that different? It may be. Maybe that 20 straight points by Florida in 9 minutes in the second quarter, as Tennessee couldn't communicate and couldn't deal with the environment. Maybe that goes the other way, or maybe it's not as bad. We'll never know. So, you look at South Carolina the other night. They've had injuries on the offensive line, and they were having to plug in true freshmen. They started two true freshmen on the offensive line, and Tennessee just ravaged them up front. And so it's about how you deal with injuries, when you peak, if you find new ways to win throughout the year. The Bru McCoy injury, it's the timing of it. You get back Cooper Mays, an all SEC caliber center, and then you lose Bru McCoy at the same time, an all SEC caliber receiver. You almost have to figure like which one of these, like which one would you take if you got to lose one of them? I think Tennessee is actually, they have the potential to probably cope with the loss of Bru McCoy a little more than the loss of Cooper Mays. I could see it going either way, but I think you can good offensive minds can scheme around losing a good wide receiver. I think there's very few schemes to compensate for a soft spot in the middle of your offensive line. And we've talked about it before. It wasn't just Cooper Mays that they lost. Then they had to slide over a guard, and they were already weak at left guard. So the middle of Tennessee's offensive line has not been great for the past month. Now that that's back, you don't have to compensate for it anymore. There are potential fixes to the Bru McCoy injury. Not great ones right now, but possibilities. Caleb Webb, maybe. Dante Thornton, the Oregon transfer, who's been more of a slot, but they may try him outside now, is a possibility. Chaz Nimrod is a versatile young guy who could maybe slide into that spot. Nathan Leacock, the freshman. They may even do something more with tight ends. Ethan Davis is their third tight end. He's a guy that's supposed to be flexed. He's more of a receiver than he is a tight end. They may try to do something with him. They've got a bye week now, an off week, to sort of be creative with their personnel. And, Bru McCoy was, he was a leader on this team. He was sort of a toughness leader. Sounds like a Butch Jones-ism, but that's sort of what
it really does.
He's the guy that would go and pop somebody in the mouth on defense, and everybody would sort of fall in line behind him. As a physical receiver, clutch receiver, could also go deep. Without him, you wonder how they sort of react. But if you can get a college wide receiver open and throw him the ball, he can catch it. And that's, I think sometimes that's easier to replace. Caleb Webb caught a touchdown pass a couple games ago. He catches it. Bru McCoy catches it. What's the difference? They lose a lot of intangibles from Bru McCoy, but they still have good wide receivers on the team. I think there's a chance they could maybe get through this better than they got through the Cooper Mays injury.
Yeah, I agree. Cooper Mays would be a bigger loss for Tennessee than Bru McCoy, although Bru McCoy is valuable, certainly. I think where Tennessee would really get into trouble if Ramel Keaton or Squirrel White went down with an injury, then then its depth would really be tested at receiver. Blake brought up Kentucky, how it did look really good Saturday. Wretched history against Tennessee. When you said Halloween, I thought potential Halloween game. I thought Big Orange and Kentucky turning into a pumpkin. I've seen Kentucky teams that were better than Tennessee's, and they still lost. They're so adept at finding ways to lose it to Tennessee, home or away, it doesn't matter. But right now, just watching those games Saturday, I would say Kentucky's a better team. I don't know if it will be in a couple of weeks. Kentucky it's on very shaky ground with depth. If it lost running back Ray Davis, the drop-off would be incredibly steep. Or if it lost its quarterback, nobody will fare well to lose a quarterback. But remember last year when Will Levis went out for Kentucky, what happened to that offense when it brought in a backup quarterback. So I still think that game is winnable for Tennessee. But watching Kentucky Saturday, its line play impressed me. I didn't know it was that strong in the line. It did what Tennessee couldn't do. It moved Florida off the ball. It moved Florida's defense off the ball. And Florida's defensive front isn't bad, but Tennessee couldn't do that. So that's going to be a tough game. This is a very tough road for Tennessee coming up. And I really think 5 games into a season, this is a case where I'm probably as unsure of where Tennessee's headed as in any season I can remember. I just think, I could still see this team losing 5 games.
The schedule's backloaded if we look at it. And maybe we knew to some extent it was going to be backloaded coming into the season with the A&M, Alabama games, Georgia. But I think when we see the realities of Florida and South Carolina, and then 5 games into the season, Missouri and Kentucky are 5-0. Now each of those teams is approaching a prove-it Saturday with Missouri hosting LSU and Kentucky going to Georgia. We'll learn more about them soon. But the schedule does seem to be backloaded, and so that does shroud things, I think, a little bit more in mystery. And yeah, when I say I felt a little bit worse coming out of Saturday, it wasn't, oh my gosh, Kentucky's going to beat Tennessee by 3 touchdowns. I think I feel like that is at best maybe a coin flip game for Tennessee, and I wouldn't have thought that going into the season. I thought, Kentucky's getting some preseason hype, but Tennessee's going to go up there and do like they've done almost every time. As you put it, John, Kentucky's going to turn into a pumpkin, and we're all going to laugh at the idea that Kentucky was ever being talked about as a threat in the East. But I'm not saying Tennessee's going to get embarrassed up in Lexington. I do feel like, based on what I've seen, Kentucky might actually be something real this year, and not just a team that can beat MAC opponents.
I think some of the suspense over Tennessee season that John is talking about, I feel that too. I think some of it comes down to Tennessee. I think some of it also comes down to just the parity in the conference. Looking at it from the preseason perspective, we'd say, well, they'll beat Kentucky. Well, Kentucky's pretty good. We said, well, they'll for sure beat Missouri. Missouri may be pretty good. You can't pencil those in as wins quite in the same way that you thought. In the preseason, we'd say, well, they're going to lose at Alabama. Alabama is still really good on defense, but Alabama is vulnerable in ways that maybe we didn't think they were. The Georgia game, Georgia is still really good, and Georgia may win the national title, but this Georgia team, to this point, is not as good as the last two. And so the teams that you probably thought would be losses, the games you thought would be losses for Tennessee, have come down to earth just a little bit. They seem like maybe they're a little more gettable. And the teams that you penciled in as wins in the preseason seem like they're going to be a little tougher. And so that makes the parity of it makes it fun. But I think that also sort of adds to the suspense for a team like Tennessee that's somewhere in the middle of all those.
Yeah, Adam, I agree. Missouri is a team. Blake brought up Kentucky. Missouri is the other team like Kentucky that I think a lot more highly of. I thought Missouri would be right above Vanderbilt, and I didn't even see any reason to put it up as high as 5th. I just thought it would be worse than Florida. This is a different Missouri team than I expected to see. We'll know more about it against LSU, but to me, that's certainly a losable game for Tennessee, and I never thought that in preseason. So many of these games could go either way, and injuries, the loss of a key player right now just changes everything. We're looking ahead to Tennessee playing Texas A&M. Texas A&M is very fortunate to have a competent backup quarterback in Max Johnson. I mean, otherwise, that injury to Connor Wigman, A&M season's over, basically. I mean, you can forget about competing for a championship, but Max Johnson's a competent quarterback, and the Aggies might beat Alabama this week.
Yeah, and that's where Tennessee, I guess, has its gaze next is Texas A&M. Tennessee in the midst of an open date this week before getting back into it with an important game against the Aggies, which would take on a scale even grander if Texas A&M were to beat Alabama this weekend. Guys, we've talked about the Bru McCoy injury a little bit, and I want to close there because it is an important development. And I agree with you guys that it's easier to scheme around a wide receiver injury than it is to your starting center. I think that's a good point. And we saw that firsthand last year when Cedric Tillman missed about half the season for Tennessee. He'd been so good the year before, was still a valuable player when he was out there last year, but he wasn't out there half the time. And Tennessee won the Orange Bowl. So we've seen you can work around these things, but Adam, I know you mentioned some names, but if we could kind of go down that road further, how do you think this affects the offense? And I guess the easiest answer is just hand the ball off more, right? I mean, Tennessee rushed for 239 on Saturday, but seriously, how do they kind of navigate around what was undeniably one of their best targets?
Well, during the off week, they're sort of at a fork in the road. They either can go about the offense as they would like to and as they have so far and just plug in a guy in a Bru spot, and they're probably not as good at that spot, but you just sort of keep going. just plan A is we're just going to go forward with the offense. It's just going to be a different name and a different jersey number over there in Bru's spot. They have to figure out if there's a guy that can do that. The other side of the road is the other path is they have to figure out a way to scheme around it. And I don't think they want to do that because you potentially could be bringing in multiple guys. That's more substitutions. That's more personnel packages. That slows the tempo. That's just not where they're comfortable being. I mean, we've talked about for the last two and a half years that Tennessee puts 3 wide receivers out there and they just stick with 3. And so they at this point don't want to be where they're having to try out different guys. Now I think that's very possible. They wouldn't sub during drives, but I could see in the A&M game maybe starting with Caleb Webb at that position. I guess he's a redshirt freshman now. And if that doesn't work out, then maybe you go to Dante Thornton or vice versa. Maybe you give Chaz Nimrod a shot there. Maybe now those are in between drives. So I think you could have different guys at that position on different drives. You also could, you could do things different with personnel and adding another flex tight end out there. Ethan Davis that I mentioned before, McCallan Castles. You could see maybe them having more 2 tights and run the ball, as you mentioned with the run game. So they've got to figure out if they can go forward with just plugging in another wide receiver, or if that's not there, they have to scheme around it. And that's what they're going to be doing all through this off week. The practices are closed, but if I had to pick a week, this is the one that I would want to be in because they're gonna put some of those wide receivers through the ringer. I think we kind of know what we'll get out of Webb and maybe Nimrod because those are young, talented receivers. They're inexperienced, but they have talent. So I could see their trajectory is going up. One of those guys was probably going to start next year, maybe both of them. Dante Thornton is the bigger question mark because he had a lot of preseason hype. I think more preseason hype than Tennessee would have wanted, although their offensive coordinator said he was a freak in the preseason. So that, you're sort of making your bed there. But Dante Thornton has had a couple of plays, but he's also had far more drops than that. Physically, I don't know if he can get off press man coverage if he's in Bru McCoy's spot. He's played the slot so far. But he has his opportunity. I mean, the last 2 years with Tennessee, Josh Heupel's first year, Jalen Hyatt was injured early in the year. He was a starter, got injured. Velus Jones Jr. took that spot and ran with it, had a all-SEC season. Jalen Hyatt had to wait a year. The next year, Cedric Tillman went out. Ramel Keaton got his chance and had a great year. Now Bru McCoy's out. And so is there a guy on this roster that will take the spot and would just keep it? And Dante Thornton has the door wide open as that next transfer to be the guy. Just so far, he hasn't looked like he's necessarily up to it. They'll find out somewhat in practice this week, but they'll find out for sure once the games start.
Going back to preseason, you could have taken Joey Halsley's comments about Thornton and thought he was talking about Randy Moss. I was ready to make him a Heisman candidate. Their offensive coordinator made him sound so talented. Freak is probably the highest compliment you can pay a player in today's game. I think it's interesting, and it makes me wonder when Adam is listing the injuries to receivers the last 3 years. It showed how much Ramel Keaton mattered last season. When Cedric Tillman went down, Ramel Keaton stepped right in. So Tennessee doesn't have a Ramel Keaton coming off the bench now. I wonder if that's kind of a flaw in this system, or if maybe since Tennessee likes to go through a possession and keep the same guys out there, force the tempo. It's worked wonderfully, but maybe you ought to work somebody else in almost on alternate possessions just to have somebody ready.
I think if there is a flaw in the system there, it's that you have to hit with your transfer. 2 years ago, Javonte Payton, they got from Mississippi State, who did not really do a whole lot at Mississippi State, but he was a starter and a deep threat for Tennessee that year. So they went into the portal, they got a guy, and it hit. They went and got Bru McCoy out of the portal, and he hit. And now they got Dante Thornton out of the portal, and he's got to be a guy. He's got to be one of your top 4 receivers, and he's had his chance as the 4th receiver, and it's still just the jury's still out. But that's what you got to do. You have to develop the young receivers, and like I mentioned, those 2 guys that I said, they feel like 1, if not 2 of those guys will be starters next year. They've liked them in practice a lot. Nathan Leacock, the freshman, same thing. But they're going to go and get a transfer every year, a wide receiver transfer, and they cannot miss on that guy. And right now, we don't know if Dante Thornton is a hit or a miss, but we'll certainly know pretty soon, because either he's going to be their 3rd starter and he's going to take off, or he's going to get a chance, not live up to it, and they're going to go with somebody else.
College football, it's that sport where being a freak is a compliment, and your Super Bowl apparently can occur in week 5. But more big games ahead for Tennessee. All the coverage over at knoxnews.com. Again, this is an open date, and Texas A&M back next week. We will be back with you then. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.